Mississippi entertained a traveler from Georgia. The occasion was a pleasant one, and it was to have astonishing consequences. The visitor had brought a rough sketch of Ely Whitney's cotton gin, invented 2 years before. The planter asked his slave, Bartley, to build a working model. In this way, the labor-saving cotton gin was introduced into Mississippi. It was to bring about a social and economic upheaval. At that time, near the start of the 19th century, Mississippi was considered the wild frontier of the Cotton Kingdom. Its chief crops were indigo and tobacco. Its largest settlement was Natchez, with a population of 9,000. Of this number, 3,500 were slaves. The plantations in the Natchez region were surrounded by the wilderness, where Indians, the Crees, the Choctaws, and the Natchez still made their home. Gradually, as the cotton gin came into widespread use, indigo and tobacco were replaced on the big plantations. Planters concentrated on raising cotton and nothing else. By the 1830s, a flood of immigrants moved in to settle new areas of the fertile land, acquired by treaty from the Indians. Soon, there arose an enormous demand for cheap labor. The demand was met by the large-scale importation of blacks. By 1850, slaves outnumbered whites in Mississippi, and by sizable numbers in the cotton lands along the major rivers. The planters' mania for land and slaves would not pass, one writer predicted, till Mississippi becomes one vast cotton field. By 1860, most of the South's wealth, money, land, and slave labor, was invested in raising cotton. The barter and trading of slaves was constant and merciless. Mississippi planters often bought slaves in New Orleans, the world's leading market for cotton and black gold. Many traders east of the Appalachians bought slaves in Virginia and Kentucky and shipped them down the Atlantic coast to markets near Natchez. Slaves in the interior were shipped down the Mississippi. This was a dread fate, for it usually meant working in the rice swamps. A trader might plan to sell a family as a group, but he would seldom refuse an offer to sell a husband, a wife, or a child alone. Let us observe what might befall one skilled slave after he had been separated from his family. As a trained servant, he would have an easier life than most slaves, but away from his family, he would have no real peace. As a house servant with special skills, he would live in the big house and would be encouraged to feel superior to the field hands. He would dress and eat well, and he might sometimes get leave to visit his wife if she were sold to a nearby plantation. This was plantation life in a frontier setting, quite different from the gracious life of the Old South. But the plantation was still a self-supporting community, even if many luxuries and traditions were missing. The success of any plantation depended on many different types of labor, and slaves provided most of the skilled labor in the South. The field hands, assigned to a hoe gang and a plow gang, were the backbone of the planter's workforce. The white overseer was boss of the work gangs and manager of the plantation, responsible for the care, conduct, and work of the slaves. Field hands lived in a different world from that of the servants in the big house. The regular working hours of a field hand were from sunrise to sunset. During harvest time, he would often work from dawn until 9 at night. During most of his day, every move he made was watched. The overseer's word was law, and the driver's whip enforcement. 30 lashes or more was common punishment for slow or careless work, for disobedience, or impudent behavior. The daily routine of threats and whippings was balanced with small rewards for good behavior, a pass to visit town on Sunday, dancing parties on holidays and at the end of the harvest season, gifts of money or food at Christmas. On most plantations, the rations of clothing and food were barely adequate for basic needs, almost always coarse and plain. For each slave, the usual ration of food was a peck of cornmeal and 3 or 4 pounds of bacon or salt pork a week. A year's supply of clothing was 2 summer suits, 2 winter suits, a straw hat and a wool hat, and 2 pairs of shoes. Most field hands lived in one-room log cabins that were drafty, barely furnished, and overcrowded. By 1860, Mississippi's black population outnumbered whites by more than 80,000. Many planters thought of their slaves as valuable but dangerous property. To protect the white population, the state organized a patrol system to police the conduct of slaves. Local citizens were drafted to patrol the highways, to arrest slaves without passes, and to break up illegal meetings. Mississippi planters, still haunted by the memory of Nat Turner's revolt, were alarmed in the 1850s by John Brown's raids in Kansas and by the growing fury of the anti-slavery movement in the major cities of the North. Pro-slavery leaders had long carried on a campaign to convince the public that slavery was good for the South and even good for black people. They argued that nature intended blacks to be common laborers, physically strong, but mentally dependent on white people. George Fitzhugh, a popular pro-slavery writer, said that slaves were the happiest and, in some sense, the freest people in the world. Fitzhugh and other writers compared the carefree life of the slave with the hard life of factory workers in the North. Mississippi slaves had no way to protest or change the system, but they did plan ways to resist and escape. A slave could play the role of a perfect Sambo, the humble, childlike, devoted servant, while plotting to run away. He could pretend illness or stupidity to avoid an unwanted job. He could steal, damage, or destroy his master's property. He could express his yearning for freedom in wonderful songs. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? And why not every man? He could take his chances with forged papers on the road, or run away and live like a hunted animal in the swamp. In a few more years, the black people of Mississippi would be free, but their lives would not be greatly changed. The old cruelties of slavery and inequality would continue for a long time. Mississippi would remain a completely segregated society for more than 100 years.